Brad Wilson just wanted to enjoy his peaceful backyard pond until the HOA decided it was illegal and slapped him with outrageous fines. Leading the charge, Linda Smith, a power-hungry tyrant who thought she could bully homeowners into submission. But Brad wasn't the type to roll over, and his fight for justice took a turn no one saw coming. And trust me, you won't believe how spectacularly the tables turned in the end. Brad Wilson had spent years making his house feel like home. Not just a home, his home. The kind of place where everything, from the neatly trimmed hedges to the custom-built koi pond in the backyard, had his personal touch. It was his sanctuary after long days of debugging spaghetti code and dealing with clueless project managers. And then the HOA decided to come after him. It started like any other day, commuting through the Texas heat, getting yelled at in Slack, eating a disappointing lunch over his keyboard. But when he pulled into his driveway, something immediately felt off. A black SUV was parked in front of his house. 3 figures in stiff, charcoal gray suits stood on his porch like they were about to deliver an eviction notice or stage an intervention. One of them, a short woman with a frosty blonde bob and the permanent scowl of someone who thrives on ruining good things, perked up as he got out of his car. "Mr. Wilson," she called out, her voice dripping with faux politeness. "We need to have a conversation." Brad barely had time to unbuckle his seatbelt before she was marching toward him, a thick manila envelope clutched in her perfectly manicured hands. "Okay," he muttered, shutting the car door. "And you are?" She flashed him a tight corporate smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Linda Smith, president of the Homeowners Association." Brad's stomach sank. Oh, this was bad. HOA people didn't just show up unannounced unless they had a mission. And judging by the vulture-like way she and her 2 associates were watching him, that mission was probably to wring money out of him like a used dish sponge. "We recently conducted a routine inspection of your property," she continued, handing him the envelope, "and we found some issues." Brad frowned as he tore it open. Inside was a stack of official-looking documents, legal jargon, highlighted violations, and at the very top, a fine of $5,000. His stomach flipped. What the hell is this?" he sputtered. $5,000? For what?" Mrs. Smith tilted her head, her smile widening just a fraction. She was enjoying this. "For the illegal pond in your backyard," she said smoothly. "It violates HOA landscaping regulations." Brad stared. "Illegal?" he echoed, like she had just accused him of running a meth lab. "It's a pond. It's been there for 3 years, and it's in my backyard." Mrs. Smith gave a slow, condescending nod. "Yes, but it is over 50 square feet, which, according to HOA bylaws, classifies it as a community resource." Brad's brain short-circuited. "I'm sorry, a what?" "A community resource," she repeated, as if explaining colors to a toddler. "Any body of water exceeding 50 square feet is considered a shared environmental asset, and as such, falls under HOA jurisdiction." Brad let out a short, hysterical laugh. "You're kidding. You're actually telling me my pond belongs to the HOA?" Mrs. Smith's smirk deepened. "Well," she said, flipping through her stack of papers, "it technically belongs to you, but any modifications, maintenance, or access rights must be approved by the HOA." Brad ran a hand down his face, trying to process the sheer level of bullshit. "Let me get this straight," he said slowly. "I built that pond with my own 2 hands. I paid for every stone, every fish, every damn filter. And now you're telling me that because it's a few inches over your arbitrary size limit, it's suddenly HOA property?" Mrs. Smith didn't even blink. "Correct." Brad felt something inside him snap. He glanced over his shoulder at his backyard, his pond, his koi fish, his peaceful little retreat that he had spent hours perfecting. And now this bureaucratic parasite in a pantsuit wanted to fine him for existing on his own damn property? "No," he said flatly. "Absolutely not." Mrs. Smith sighed as if he were being difficult on purpose. "Mr. Wilson, I understand this is frustrating," she said in the same tone customer service reps use when they don't actually care. "But you did sign the HOA agreement when you bought this home. If you refuse to comply, we will have no choice but to escalate." Brad felt his blood pressure spike. "Escalate? To what? You gonna send in the HOA SWAT team to seize my fish?" Mrs. Smith's expression didn't waver. Failure to pay the fine within 30 days will result in additional penalties and, if necessary, legal action. Legal action over a pond. Brad had never hated anyone more in his life. His fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to exhale slowly. If he exploded now, he'd give them exactly what they wanted, proof that he was unreasonable. Instead, he took the shitty, overpriced violation notice, shoved it back in the envelope, and turned toward his front door. "You have a nice day, Mrs. Smith," he said coldly. Her smile didn't budge. "Oh, I will," she replied, before adding in an almost sing-song tone, "See you at the hearing." And just like that, they walked off, leaving Brad standing there, gripping the envelope so tightly his knuckles went white. A hearing, over his own damn pond. As their SUV pulled away, he looked down at the fine again, his vision blurring with rage. $5,000, and if he didn't pay, they could take him to court. His jaw tightened. No, hell no. They wanted a fight. They were going to get one. Brad didn't sleep that night. Not because he didn't want to, because he couldn't. Every time he shut his eyes, he saw Linda Smith's smug, corporate smile, the way she delivered that bullshit fine like she was doing him a favor. $5,000, $5 fucking grand. For a pond that had been in his yard for years. For a rule that he had never seen in any HOA agreement, his blood boiled. This wasn't about landscaping regulations. This wasn't about community resources. This was about power. HOAs thrived on control. They didn't enforce rules to keep the neighborhood nice. They enforced rules to remind everyone who was in charge. Not him, not anymore. The paper trail. By sunrise, Brad was sitting at his kitchen table, his laptop open, surrounded by folders, receipts, and documents dating back years. He had poured thousands of dollars into this property, and if the HOA thought they could shake him down, they were dead wrong. After 2 hours of digging, he found exactly what he needed, the original deed to his house. No mention of HOA jurisdiction over personal landscaping. The permit for his pond, approved by the county 3 years ago. A neighborhood planning document from 2018 showing that the HOA bylaws had been changed after he moved in. They were retroactively enforcing a rule that didn't even exist when he built the pond. Brad leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. Gotcha, you corrupt little gremlins. The resistance begins. But Brad knew paperwork wouldn't be enough. The HOA didn't care about rules. They cared about winning. If he wanted to fight them, he needed more than documents. He needed people. So he did something he hadn't done in years. He talked to his neighbors. At first, it was just casual conversations, testing the waters, bringing up his HOA fine like an annoyed homeowner. And the more people he talked to, the more he realized he wasn't alone. Oh, those snakes? They fined me last year for leaving my garbage bins out 10 minutes past pickup. They tried to charge me for having unapproved holiday decorations. It was a damn pumpkin. They threatened to tow my car for extended street parking. I was literally unloading groceries. Everywhere he looked, there were victims, people who had been fined, threatened, or bullied into submission. And yet, nobody had ever fought back, because they were scared. The HOA was a mafia in beige cardigans. They had the money, the legal teams, and the power to make people's lives hell. Brad felt something dark settle in his chest. These people weren't just assholes. They were parasites. And if no one else was willing to do something about it, he would. The meeting. By the end of the week, Brad had gathered a dozen homeowners in his backyard. Some were pissed. Some were cautious. All of them had HOA horror stories. Brad stood in front of them, arms crossed, staring down at the battle-worn soldiers of suburban oppression. This, he said, holding up his fine, is what they do. They make up rules. They change bylaws. They pull numbers out of thin air and expect us to just pay up. And if we don't? He smacked the paper against his palm. They threaten us. Murmurs of agreement, nods. They don't own our houses, Brad continued. They don't own our property, but they act like they do. And the worst part? We let them. We've been putting up with this crap for years because we're afraid of the consequences. He scanned the group, locking eyes, with a gray-haired man clutching a HOA violation notice from 2019. A single mom who had been fined for having a non-standard mailbox. a couple who had been forced to repaint their house 3 times because the HOA didn't like the shade. Brad clenched his fist. "No more," he said. The crowd shifted. People looked at each other, some hesitant, some excited, some just waiting to see if he really meant it. One of them, a stocky guy in his 40s, cleared his throat. "So, what's the plan?" Brad grinned. "We hit 'em where it hurts." The HOA thrived on money, bureaucracy, and fear. Brad was about to take all 3 away from them. The lies spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, half the neighborhood had heard the HOA's version of the story. Brad's pond wasn't just a violation, they said. It was a hazard, a potential environmental threat, a breeding ground for mosquitoes. Brad read their bullshit complaint on the HOA's website. "While we value community efforts in beautification, unauthorized water features can disrupt the ecosystem and pose health risks." They made it sound like he'd built a toxic swamp in his backyard. But the worst part, people were buying it. Neighbors who used to wave at him now crossed the street. Conversations died down when he walked into a room. Even the guy who borrowed his lawnmower last month now avoided eye contact. The HOA's counterattack. By Monday, HOA letters started hitting mailboxes. Any resident who publicly supported Brad would be subjected to a mandatory property inspection, and anyone who attended his meetings could face new HOA fines, signs, petitions, or protests. Immediate violation notices. Linda Smith wasn't just fighting back, she was making examples out of people. Brad watched as his movements started to unravel. One by one, his allies backed down. "Brad, I got a notice about my fence being too tall." "They just hit me with a $300 fine for unapproved garden decorations." "I can't afford to fight these people, man." Brad could see it in their faces, fear. The HOA had spent years conditioning people to submit, not him. The breaking point. The final straw came on Friday morning. Brad woke up to a loud, mechanical grinding sound. He threw on a hoodie and ran outside, just in time to see a backhoe parked in his yard, and next to it, clipboard in hand, stood Linda Smith. Her face split into a cold, satisfied smile. "Morning, Mr. Wilson," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace. "We're here to remove the pond." Brad's stomach dropped. "What?" His voice came out sharp, disbelieving. She tapped the clipboard. "You were given notice. HOA Regulation 14B clearly states that I own this pond." His hands curled into fists. "You can't just—" Linda cut him off with a sigh. "Hey, Mr. Wilson, the association has the authority to enforce community standards. If you want to appeal, you can take it up with the board." She gestured to the backhoe operator. "Go ahead." The engine roared to life. Brad barely had time to react. He threw himself forward, arms outstretched, blocking the machine. "Get off my property," he yelled. Neighbors gathered. Some just watched, others whispered. A few pulled out their phones. Linda's expression darkened. "Mr. Wilson, step aside." "Like hell I will." Brad stood his ground. For a split second, there was silence. Then Linda sighed, like he was just some annoying child throwing a tantrum. She turned to the operator. "Start digging." The man hesitated, and that's when Brad snapped. The protest. Brad didn't just want revenge. He wanted a reckoning. So he did the one thing the HOA couldn't ignore. He went public. Social media, local news stations, neighborhood forums. He put the HOA on blast. He posted screenshots of their fines and harassment. He leaked emails showing how they threatened residents into silence. He made a TikTok rant that went viral. This is what an HOA does. They don't protect property values. They steal from homeowners and silence anyone who fights back. You think your house is yours, not if these leeches have a say in it. By the time he hit 10,000 views, people were furious. And then came the moment Brad had been waiting for. Linda Smith. Flanked by 2 HOA board members, she stepped out of her pristine white Mercedes, her face twisted with rage. She looked at the cameras, the signs, the crowd chanting, "HOAs are scams." Her grip tightened on her designer purse. She had lost control. Brad met her eyes. Checkmate. The courtroom was dead silent. Brad sat with his arms crossed, his lawyer beside him, as the judge, an older man with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression, flipped through the case files. Across the aisle sat Linda Smith and 2 other HOA board members, their faces stiff, their postures unnaturally straight. They had walked in smug, confident, untouchable. Now, Linda's manicured fingers twisted the pearl necklace around her throat. She was sweating. Brad fought the urge to smirk. The judge sighed, set the papers down, and looked at Linda over the rim of his glasses. "Miss Smith," he said, voice dripping with sarcastic exhaustion, "do you know what private property means?" Linda's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The judge continued, "Because, from what I'm seeing here, you and your organization seem to think that Mr. Wilson's backyard belongs to you." He let that hang for a moment before adding, "It doesn't." Brad watched as Linda turned pale. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping the papers with a finger. "You issued thousands of dollars in illegal fines. You threatened residents. You attempted to destroy a structure on private land." He tilted his head. "Tell me, Miss Smith, did you think you had more power than you actually do?" The room was so quiet, you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing. Linda's jaw clenched. Her nostrils flared. Brad could see it happening in real time, the moment she realized she had lost. Then the judge delivered the final blow. The court rules in favor of Mr. Wilson. The HOA falls apart. By the time Brad stepped out of the courtroom, a crowd was waiting. Neighbors, reporters, even a few people from other neighborhoods with their own HOA horror stories. As soon as they saw him, cheers erupted. Brad barely had time to register what was happening before someone clapped him on the back. "You did it, man." "Finally, someone put these HOA assholes in their place." Brad laughed, a deep, relieved sound. He raised a fist in the air. The crowd cheered louder. And Linda? She walked out, flanked by her board members, her face twisted with rage and humiliation. Cameras flashed. Reporters shoved microphones in her face. "Miss Smith, do you have a comment? How does it feel to lose so publicly? Is it true that other residents are now suing the HOA?" Her eyes flicked to Brad. He grinned. Checkmate. Victory. The HOA's downfall was swift. Within weeks, Linda resigned. The board dissolved. Residents voted to disband the HOA entirely. Brad's pond, the very thing they had tried to erase, became a symbol. A symbol of resistance, of justice, of telling corrupt HOA tyrants to go *CK themselves. And Brad? He stood by the water one evening, beer in hand, staring at the reflection of the sunset on the surface. No more fines, no more threats, no more power-hungry lunatics trying to control his life, just peace, and it had never tasted so damn sweet.